Hey everybody, what's up from Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics never go out of style. In this video, I wanted to weigh in on the vintage versus modern conversation that's currently unfolding here on YouTube. Now, I absolutely love a good debate, as long as it's not too divisive or aggressive, and lately, that is the direction it seems like it's been trending in. Now, I believe that everyone deserves a seat at the table and a voice in the discussion, and it's these types of discussions that can lead to a more productive and a healthy understanding of the hobby in its entirety. Now, I've said this before, and I'll say it again, but I do believe that the debate between modern and vintage is fundamentally flawed. It's an either-or fallacy, because these two are not mutually exclusive, and in some cases, both vintage and modern can be two different avenues capable of accomplishing the same or similar goals. Having said that, there are some points and statements that I've heard parroted across YouTube that I fundamentally disagree with, and it's those statements that I wanted to address in this video. Enter Nostalgianomics. Recently, I reached out to Alex and asked if I could use some of his statements as sort of a bellwether for modern collecting and approach them with my own bias and experience as a long-term vintage collector. So that's what we're going to do in this video, but first let me just state I really respect Alex and I find myself agreeing with him a lot more than I thought I would, even though he comes from a very different background and perspective with his channel and with his interests than I do personally. But in this video, we're going to take a look at 3 specific points of contention that I have, starting with areas where I agree on the point, then also giving my critique and my own perspective on it. These types of conversations that I think are good for all of us in the hobby, and I encourage you guys to let me know what you think down in the comments below. Do you agree, disagree, or is there some middle ground there where it's a bit more complicated than just a black or white scenario? Anyway, guys, let's roll into point number 1. The first point that I'd like to address is the idea that popularity is more important than the fundamentals. Now, we've heard SM Pratt say it before, the older, the rarer, the minter, the better, and I've heard others on YouTube saying that popularity is more important than those fundamentals. Now, here's where I agree. I do think that popularity is a very important factor to the success of any investment, whether it's an individual card, a sealed product, or anything in between. I've heard it said that masses move markets, and that's certainly true. We've seen that in a number of ways with modern products. Going back to 2020, there were empty shelves due to the popularity of Pokemon. This led to shortages and then scalping with new record high prices, which in turn led to more printers being brought online to meet that demand, and again, record prices being achieved. And now we're seeing a greater volume of Pokemon cards produced than ever before. We also saw the power of popularity in vintage cards when it came to popular Pokemon often outperforming others. Even despite population reports in certain graded condition, sometimes popular Pokemon like your Charizards, your Pikachus, your Mewtwo's are inherently going to do better than their less popular peers. I don't think anyone could argue that popularity is definitely important. To me, this seems like an argument that demand is more important than supply, and here I would have to push back and disagree. I find that the fundamentals are more important, perhaps the most important factor when assessing the long-term investability or collectability of any given item. And we've heard SM Pratt say it before, but the older, the rarer, the minter, the better. That's really more of a supply side argument, arguing that it's the supply and the rarity of it that determines the market demand. Here's where I would stand. I think it's kind of a combination between those two. And when I think of fundamentals, I actually incorporate a couple different ones that sometimes people leave out of the equation. For me, it's all about rarity, the release circumstances and how difficult a card is to pull or to acquire. The scarcity, how many of that card is available on the market at any given time. The condition of the card, what type of condition is it in? Is it a high grade or a lower grade? Is it played with? Is it mint? If it's a sealed product, you're at that peak level of condition. But even sealed products have their own different thresholds. The history of the card is one thing that I would put in, or the history of the item. If it has a story behind it or it has unique circumstances, that's something that's going to draw some of that popularity piece. It's going to make people excited for it. And then my last fundamental would be the popularity. What is the demand like? Is this a Pokemon that people are generally more favorable towards or is it one that gets lost in the mix? So to me, when I think of all of the different fundamentals, those are the ones that I would say have the biggest influence on the collectability or the investability of any given product. And this is proven across countless different collectible genres. Most desirable items are almost always those with some level of exclusivity. This goes back to SM Pratt's point about older, rare, mint, or better. You could look at modern products like the Pokemon Center exclusive UPCs for celebrations. Those are more difficult to find and to acquire, and therefore demand a higher premium than some of those other more mass-released Pokemon boxes. You look at the Japanese promos and some of the ones that are still out there outperforming everything else, even as the market is generally in a downtrend. It's because of that exclusivity. We also see that with vintage, with cards that have a much lower population in high condition are consistently outperforming other cards out there. Population, condition are highly correlated with price, and there's a reason for that. It's because of that exclusivity. So my bottom line is this: if we're trying to approach modern and vintage as a debate about what's more important, popularity or supply, it's really a supply versus demand argument. And I think when it comes to a collectible investment, it should have both. Psychologically, it's that exclusivity that often drives demand, that there are countless examples out there of people within Pokemon and outside of the Pokemon hobby that are looking for those truly historic, unique items that are difficult to acquire. To me, there's no debating that. But again, it's not mutually exclusive. If nobody wants it because it's not popular, well, of course that's going to draw down the price. So I'd look for something that has both. The second point that I hear repeated across the community that I fundamentally disagree with is that there is no nostalgia for vintage cards, leading to low growth and potential stagnation in the future. Now, starting with where I agree that modern is more accessible to younger collectors, and it's likely to mature and grow over time as those younger collectors grow older as well and are seeking that sense of nostalgia back to their own childhoods with what they collected. I also agree that sealed modern product has a lot of potential, if for no other reason for its utility. There is so much you can do with a sealed box. You could collect the sealed products. You could have fun opening those and doing pack openings with friends or live streaming. Perhaps you collect the cards to use in actual competitive deck building and you play the game. Maybe you take those individual cards and you send them in for grading and you start a sealed slab collection. Regardless of which option you choose, there are a lot of different things you could do with it. And it's also worth noting that the entry price point for a lot of these modern sealed boxes is relatively low, especially if you're entering at the time of release. It's a low downside risk, and that's something that I've heard Alex address on his channel a number of times, and he's right. Even after you take into consideration the fees and the shipping, and maybe some of the difficulty of liquidity of selling those items, you're still not risking a whole lot unless you're putting tens of thousands of dollars into buying mass quantities, which most collectors aren't doing anyway. But here's where I disagree. Vintage cards, I believe, will continue to appreciate despite the lack of nostalgia. Why do I think this? Well, I think this because of historical precedent. If you take a look at literally any historical collectible out there, vintage tends to outperform modern, whether it's sports cards, Magic the Gathering, the big brother to Pokemon, video games. All of these have an interest in the historical items, despite the fact that most collectors now weren't around when those initial releases were made. People have a habit of coming back to the classics, which is why I say on this channel, the classics never go out of style. Let's take a look at baseball, for example. Baseball used to be America's pastime. It was the most popular sport in the country. And even though it's not anymore today, it's experienced a massive drop in popularity. The cards that people think of, the ones that are truly investable and collectible, are vintage. You've got the Mickey Mantle card, the Honus Wagner card. Really interesting historical backstory behind that card. When it comes to Magic the Gathering, which is probably the best overall analogy to Pokemon, it's the Power 9, the Alpha set, the Beta set. Even the commons and uncommons in those sets are still worth a small fortune. When it comes to video games, take a look at the video games that people are ultimately collecting. It's the vintage games, the vintage systems, which many kids today have never owned or played in their life. An original NES system, the 8-bit version. They've never played some of those Nintendo 64 games, but yet those are the games that are outperforming many of the others. Bottom line is this: when it comes to collectibles, I think often Modern is an entry point into increasingly rare items. We talked about this a bit in my first point, but it's human psychology to be drawn towards that sense of exclusivity, and that exclusivity often drives demand. It's not the only factor. Popularity does play a role, but again, there's got to be a little bit of balance there. Personally, I see little reason to believe that those that are passionate about Pokemon wouldn't want to trek back to its origins later in life when they have more discretionary income, when they feel more attached to the hobby in a more significant way than just a child growing up playing with it. I mean, I think that's the universal condition of a collector, is that as we reach those collection goals, we slowly evolve and we look for increasing levels of difficulty and challenge to progress our own collections. So I'm not too worried about vintage. The third and final statement as part of this debate that I want to address is the idea that the data convincingly supports modern collecting and investing over vintage. Now again, we'll start with where I agree, and I agree that modern has done exceptionally well in the last few years, and I'm actually a bit surprised by this. So compliments to you, Alex. You've done a great job presenting the data, and it is a little bit surprising to me. Admittedly, Modern has outperformed a number of vintage cards, especially in the last year or two. However, when it comes to modern Pokemon, and Pokemon in general, we are emerging from a major statistical anomaly. So I think we need to be careful about decontextualizing data from a larger historical context, because that context does matter. Maybe this is the new norm going forever into the future, but I don't think we can assume that. To me, that's dangerous. Just for some context for you, the last couple years, vintage slabs experienced exponential growth. 2020 to 2021, we're seeing a stabilizing phase emerging after all of that upward movement. And so I don't know if it's fair to use some of the price data that we're seeing right now as an overall representation of the investability of vintage throughout history and into the future. For modern, we've seen 2 years of high demand and supply shortages, so it's almost the opposite, as a lot of pent-up demand and lack of accessibility have motivated people towards buying the products that they were unable to get. It's also worth noting that historically speaking, modern hasn't performed this well. In fact, I talked about this in one of my previous videos, but if you guys know Rudy from Alpha Investments, he filled an entire bathroom with modern Pokemon cards that he had bought with the purpose of reselling. And these he bought significantly below MSRP. And then after the major hype of 2016, when he bought in, there was a downtrend. A lot of those products lost ground or just stayed stagnant. And he was looking at taking a pretty massive loss on that investment. Now, when it came to 2021, he made it all back and then some because those prices went right back up. But for those few years, it was looking pretty brutal. So my point with this is also my area of disagreement, in that I think sometimes we cherry pick data or take data out of context to support a specific narrative rather than allowing the historical context from which that data is derived help us make sense of that data. And I've heard a number of different PokeTubers say we should focus on the here and now when it comes to collecting and investing, rather than worrying about what prices were 3 years ago, 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, that it has no bearing on current investing. But I think it does. I think that history actually does matter, and it helps us make better sense of what we're doing and what some of those trends and patterns may look like in the future. To illustrate this point, there was a back and forth that happened between PokeKnowledge cards and Nostalgianomics. And initially, it started with Nostalgianomics presenting some sealed modern boxes, comparing their price gains to vintage cards, in particular PSA 10 cards from Sky Ridge and other sets, over the timeline of 2017 to present. Now, initially, Alex showed that the sealed modern boxes outperformed those vintage cards, but then PokeKnowledge cards responded by showing a bunch of other Sky Ridge cards that actually outperformed those same sealed modern boxes. So we had two different conclusions using some similar data. In response to that, Nostalgianomics used a different data set from 2020 to present saying what matters is here and now, and then the conclusion reversed once again. And I think that just goes to show how easily the data can be construed to different narratives depending on which data we're specifically looking at. So I do think there's a bit of a danger there. A bit of a tangent perhaps, but I think this demonstrates the difficulty in comparing vintage to modern in this type of investment scenario, where entry point and duration make a world of difference. If we took a modern sealed product at its origin, at its release, where the price is the lowest it could possibly be, unless dropping below MSRP, and measured it again in a year or two, there's a lot of room there for growth. And at $80, it wouldn't be hard to make a decent percentage back, considering the low price point. However, doing the same with vintage isn't always fair, since a lot of that growth has already been achieved much earlier on in the life of that card. For example, in one of his videos, Alex used a $900 first edition Dark for Alligator from Neo Destiny in PSA 10. It's $900. This might have been originally a $5 card, meaning in its lifetime, this card has achieved about an 1,800% growth. For an $80 sealed modern box to do that, it would need to reach $14,400 at some point in its lifespan. Something that seems incredibly unlikely considering how many boxes are printed and in circulation out there. Now, obviously, this isn't a fair comparison. I'm not trying to suggest that it is, because if you're making an investment, it doesn't matter if it was 5 years ago, you can't go back and invest in that price. And I know that's his point, and it's a fair point to make, but having that historical context in mind is beneficial if we're looking at trends, trajectories, and where something might go in the future based on its past performance. It's easier for an $80 box to double in the short term than a $2,000 vintage slab that has already tripled in the previous year. And so taking those and measuring them in the same short duration, I think, is disingenuous to the potential of both of those two products. This is also the point that I think a lot have raised some skepticism on about Alex's statement about the S&P 500, saying that modern sealed Pokemon product has outperformed the S&P 500 this year. That's true. The S&P 500 is down 15 to 20%, somewhere in that range. But using that small window as our duration isn't really fair to the historical nature of the S&P 500. Granted, it's probably not doubling in a year. That's generally not how traditional investing works, but it can be a bit misleading when our snapshot is so narrow, and that's the point that I'm trying to make. We also need to be careful about using bad or insufficient data when supporting our claims. In one of his videos, Alex was comparing sealed modern product to some of the more iconic vintage collectible cards out there, including the first edition PSA 9 Charizard, which he quoted at about $10,000.
This card is selling somewhere around $10,000 today.
Now, in all fairness to Alex, this wasn't his fault, but on eBay and the sold listings, there were several sold sales at that price point, all of which were fraudulent. Same seller, same photos, same non-transactions. In reality, using a number of different sites, the sale price of a PSA 9 first edition Charizard is currently between $20,000 and $25,000, which is significantly down from its all-time high a few years earlier, but that's still significantly more than that $10,000 price point. Another example of this was the Houndoom from Skyridge in PSA 10 that sold for $2,800. In one of his videos, Alex acknowledged the sale and said it was a really good price, but mentioned that it had remained flat ever since. And the reason for that is it's such a scarce card that rarely comes up for sale, that was the only sale was in March of 2021. There hasn't been another sale since then, thus remaining flat. Now again, that's not Alex's fault. It's just sometimes the data out there is flawed or insufficient to really get a good determination on. And that is one of the benefits of modern, I would say, is that it's much easier to determine fair market value just due to the volume of sales that are happening on a regular basis. In short, here's my bottom line. Data requires appropriate context and history to interpret well. Otherwise, we can use it to interpret whatever we want, but if we want a more fuller, more accurate understanding of what the market is doing, that historical context makes a difference. After Alex's last video, it's hard to argue that modern isn't performing well lately, because it is. And Nostalgianomics has done a great job presenting his perspective, and I am rather surprised by it, even as a vintage guy. It's my opinion, though, even after all this, in spite of it all, that an investment should be more than just the here and now, especially when the market conditions have been a bit abnormal in the last few years, to say the least. That's not to say that modern is bad or somehow inferior, because it's not. It's just a different genre serving another segment of the community, a valuable segment. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap it up for this one. Special thanks to Alex Nostalgianomics for giving me permission to dissect and critique his videos a bit. I really enjoy his content, and even though we don't agree on everything, I really respect his perspective and his motives. And I highly encourage you guys to check out his channel if you haven't. Ultimately, having that diversity of perspectives, of interests, of approaches to the hobby, one of the things that makes Pokemon truly special. I think we should all have respect for everyone and acknowledge that there are no right ways or wrong ways to collect. It's whatever you enjoy, whether that be modern or vintage. They're all paths that lead to the same outcome. That's our entertainment and enjoyment. Anyway, guys, I'm Pokemon Classics, reminding you that the classics, they never go out of style. We'll see y'all with the next video. Until then, live well and have fun. Bye, everybody.